Hello, everyone.
Okay.
To our segment of, if you're new here, or a regular, I should say, our regular programming schedule of Two Liberals and a Marxist, which is a joke, inside joke that we've had for sort of the best part of a year and a half, where we do these live streams together. Myself, Pyotr Kurzin, a former diplomat to the UN, Michael Rossi, professor at Rutgers University, and James Ker Lindsay, expert on YouTube and law of statecraft. And James, to be honest, I don't actually full know your best professional title, but yes, we are here for a summary of 2025, look back, and also a sort of introduction to 2026. We will be talking mainly about Russia, Ukraine, and Europe, but I think it's worth also looking towards Venezuela, the escalations that Trump has been doing there, and probably immediately, therefore, what happened in the Middle East with Iran, and also what's happening in Iran right now with the ongoing protests. And also China is undertaking tests against Taiwan. So there is a hell of a load of things, but we are mainly orientated, or at least Michael and I am, very much focused on Russia, Ukraine, or James covers many different things that I touch on occasionally. But it's lovely to be back here. We did attempt to do this a few weeks ago, but we tried to use different software and it didn't work out. But we are here using regular software, and we're looking forward to doing this perhaps more regularly next year as well. And I have some exciting ideas as well in terms of merch. Some of you have been suggesting we get some shirts. I've got some fantastic coffee coasters on the way. So if you want a bit of a joke, you want a mug that actually says, like, it's got my face and James's and Michael's, or maybe just one of our faces because you hate me but love Michael.
Oh God, Pyotr.
Then no, I'm being
we
great.
all love you. Yeah, it's all right. And by the way, can I just chip in for anyone, because it has been a little while since we did this, and we did. Pyotr, well done. Past 100,000. I think you sailed past it now, but fantastic result.
Absolutely.
We're not finished yet. But thank you very much, guys. Yes, it's been a long time coming. I'm actually back where I was when I decided to launch a YouTube channel 2 years ago, and I said to myself, I want to do it within 2 years, and we managed it. But I look at other people growing, and I think there's a lot more that is coming to YouTube. I'm very concerned about the conditions of this chat platform and X, where we're also streaming, and Facebook and Twitter and all the other platforms with AI slop, but also just broader disinformation. One of the reasons we enjoy having these conversations is because it allows us to cut through the noise genuinely. Michael vehemently disagrees with me, or maybe James, on some things. I largely agree with James on some things, but also differ. And I think that's the point that we try to do here, is genuinely cross the aisle and engage with one another in different ways. Whilst a lot of people will claim that they do, but they don't. Anyway, let's get into it, gentlemen. So in the past 24 hours, Russia has claimed that Ukraine has conducted or attempted to conduct a direct attack on one of Putin's residences in Novgorod. I was quick to respond to this with a post that I put on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube, saying this is, to me, a classic false flag. There's absolutely no evidence, there's no reports. Residents in the area heard F all. And most importantly, Putin probably wasn't there. Why on earth would he be in this random residence at this time of year when things around the peace deals are quite active? Doesn't make sense. So to me, this is just typical Russian escalation cycle. They want to get ahead of the peace talks and try to reframe the narrative and have something, optionality, in the sense of they can delegitimize Ukraine, they can target more civilians, as we saw in the heinous attacks over the weekend. They do this every time that there seems to be progress diplomatically. Remember 3-4 years ago when the Russians lost a lot of territory because of the Ukrainian counteroffensive around Kharkiv. What did Putin do? He resorted to pretty high, intense nuclear threats. When Trump and Putin were meeting in Alaska, he resorted to blanketing the country with missile barrages. So this is something that is pretty typical Russian playbook. But of course, everyone who is a Russian lunatic or Putinist lunatic says that this is, Ukraine is the problem. And I have to be honest, last point before I hand it to both of you is the tweet by Modi this morning just saying he's very concerned by these developments without, again, there being a shred of evidence that this is actually being conducted by Ukraine. I'm not saying it is impossible. Ukraine can do this, but I don't see why Ukraine would do that when they are actually making progress in the peace talks. I don't see why they would self-sabotage, but maybe you both have a different view.
I don't know. No. I think obviously this is a really interesting development, but I mean, I think in many ways you really hit the nail on the head with that final bit, which was progress in the peace talks, because this is really the great question: have we been seeing real progress in the peace talks? It seems that we've just been here so much over this past year. And it looks like, there's big talk from the White House, something's going to happen, and then it just sort of gets kicked into the long grass. And it just doesn't seem quite clear what is going on here, where we stand. It's all very opaque. And then, as you said, suddenly we have Russia now saying that, Ukraine is acting in bad faith because it's trying to attack one of Putin's residences, that, clearly insinuating that Ukraine was trying to assassinate Putin. So I think this just all ties in with a situation which is just really, really difficult to make sense of at the moment. I mean, I just don't know where we're going with all of this. I think, it's quite clear Zelensky knows that he has got to play this very diplomatic game. But it seems that Putin isn't even bothering to play a diplomatic game. I mean, he's just trying everything in his power to scupper any progress on talks. But I can't imagine, to be fair, that Ukraine is trying to advance talks under, what Trump was putting forward.
Oh, this is my cue? Okay.
Yes.
You jump in, Michael. I don't know. I was waiting for Pyotr to kind of hand the microphone over to me.
No. I'm not gonna be quite as handholdy. If you guys just want to jump in.
That's fine. I think that I will, for my own 2 cents here, what we have seen in the last couple of months regarding attempts by the international community to find an endgame for Ukraine is that we're approaching it from at least 2 diametrically opposed positions. So you have, for the sake of simplicity, the Washington-Moscow approach, the so-called Trump peace plan, which I'm not even sure if this peace plan is still on the table. We read it, we looked at it. It seemed like it gave Russia almost everything within the context of what it was seeking. And then we have, for, again, the sake of simplicity, the Kiev-Brussels peace plan, which gives Ukraine far more leverage at the negotiating table, which, look, I mean, basic understandings of negotiated settlements revolve around 2 things. Number one, what is the rhetoric of the proposed peace conditions? And the second one is who has the greater leverage, not only on the battlefield, but also within diplomatic circles here. Right now, Putin feels that he has all of the cards, and he is playing a very, very strategic game in placating and stoking Trump's ego, constantly referring to the idea that the United States is a rational, sensible broker for peace, when he's not talking about how the United States has been leading NATO to expand right up to Russia's borders. It's a sort of a 50-50 balance here. But when it comes to the alleged attack on one of Putin's residences, especially in Novgorod, I don't know why he would be in Novgorod, at this time of the year. He would be in Moscow. If it's either a couple of things: A, it is a false flag, Pyotr, as you point out, or number 2, it is a way for Ukraine to show once again to Russia that they may be losing town after town in Ukraine, but they can still hit Russia where it hurts. Maybe this was a sign. Maybe this was just simply an indicator that we may be losing in Ukraine, but we can still hit you. where it counts. I don't know. But what I do know, one thing that I've been able to ascertain, James, you might, jump in or disagree with me on all of this, is that everybody, and this kind of gives me the impression that we're headed towards a frozen conflict. And a frozen conflict in the idea that every major talking head condemns and laments the fact that we're heading for a frozen conflict. They don't want some kind of a deadlock. They want some movement forward, either from Russia's side, from Ukraine's side, but they don't have the cards. They don't have the leverage to get what they want right now. So what they do is create these little kerfluffles that scuttle talks of peace deals for another week, another 2 weeks, another month, or whatever it is. Maybe get Trump to change his mind. I think both Zelensky and Putin they know one thing. They know that Trump loves to respond well to positive flattery. And it seems to me that Zelensky is playing this up really well, just trying to get the United States to move away from Russia. Then Putin responds by saying a few things, Lavrov works well with Rubio, all that kind of stuff. I don't know. The way that I just see this is that it's a lot of noise to just simply prolong, the negotiating settlement.
What would you say, Michael? I mean, sorry, jump in on this one, Pyotr, but I'm just sort of thinking, is it so much Zelensky is doing this, or others, or Europe is doing this? Because I think it's a very interesting sort of post that I saw on social media that was sort of showing Zelensky arriving in Florida for his meeting with Trump, and there was no senior US official,
no one to greet him at all,
no one who greeted him. And if you then compare that with the red carpet that was rolled out for Putin in Alaska earlier in the year, it was really, really telling. It just simply seems to say that the United States has absolutely no respect whatsoever, or the Trump administration has absolutely no respect for Zelensky, for Ukraine whatsoever. Well, and James, I get the sense that the heavy lifting, if Ukraine is being kept in the game, it's because Europe.
It is Europe. It is absolutely Europe's case. That there's no question about that.
I made a video on this just a week ago. It suddenly got very popular with people a couple of days later. But what is happening right here? Why is Putin targeting Europe suddenly? Because he looks at the world through a great power political lens, right? You can say that GPP is also GPC, or great power competition, in the sense of that in the past few years, at least under the Biden administration, the great power politics of the world has been defined by competition. But Trump doesn't want to compete with these powers. He wants to be on better terms with them. And so he looks to Trump, Putin, and President Xi Jinping and that as his equivalents, as the ones he wants to emulate. But that means having to snub the smaller powers. And that means also Europe. Trump views Europe with as much contempt as Putin does in some ways. Or if he doesn't, Vance certainly does, and the people around Trump certainly do. So for me, why is Putin suddenly targeting Europe, or most specifically the UK, right? We've seen a few articles dotted around the internet from the UK media saying that they are enemy number one now because America's moved out of Russia's way. The UK remains the main bastion of the Anglo-Saxon sort of, world order leadership, etc., and have always been much more hawkish on Russia than parts of continental Europe. And so Putin now targets Europe vehemently with strong rhetoric. What did he say? They're little pigs, or whatever it was. As much snidey and aggressive, nasty comments as he can. But that's because he's irritated. He's irritated that Europe is getting in the way, preventing Russia from being reintegrated into Trump's world economy, the loosening of sanctions, the reducing of pressure. Because as I'm sure we'll come to later on in the conversation, I talk about every month now with Konstantin Smalyov about the Russian economy. It's in a shit show. Everything is coming to collide with Russia. You've got no growth, you've got high inflation or sticky inflation, and you've got exports completely on the back end because oil prices now in Russia are at $34 a barrel, when the Russian budget for the next 3 years was based on estimates that would be double that. So Putin's not in a great way in Europe, economically, and Europe is therefore sustaining that problem. So it doesn't surprise me too much now that Europe is enemy number one. And if you just look at the garbage on X, which we are streaming, so sorry, people who follow me on X, you're not garbage, but the posts, unfortunately, that literate are of how, the Europeans are this fascist. My favorite thing about that, just as a side note before I hand it back to you guys, is that apparently Europe can be both communist or socialist on one hand, but also fascist.
Rational debate has left the room, I'm afraid, over there.
So I personally think that this is Europe is doing quite a lot suddenly. How much it sustains, and also whether or not that makes a difference in the longer term scale. Because right now we have a question of strategic endurance. Can the Europeans support the Ukrainians long enough whilst the Americans do what they want to do, and up to the midterm? In the midterm.
But hasn't that been the story of this year in many ways? That and are we finally getting to that moment that Europe seems to get it? Because it really is amazing. I mean, just to look back at the past, over the course of 2025, and the number of things that have happened, and it really has been this roller coaster ride, it seems like years have been condensed into these past 11 months or so, and we would keep seeing at the start of the Trump presidency, Europe sort of being humiliated, being talked down by the Trump administration, and then coming back and saying, right, okay, we're going to have to get our act together, but then managed to seem to win Trump over diplomatically. In whatever way that is, where you've got the European leaders, remember that scene of them going after Zelensky had been humiliated, and you had Meloni and you had Merz and Macron and Starmer and Staub, all sat there playing up on Trump's ego, and everyone think, oh, right, okay, we won him around. And then you obviously had the NATO summit, but then it sort of slides back, and then you had the NATO summit, if I'm remembering the order right. With Rutte, that ridiculous daddy comment, playing up to Trump as well. And then everyone thought, oh, finally, he's back on side. He gets it. He's taking out more pro-Ukraine position. That amazing scene that we saw at the funeral of Pope Francis, where Trump and Zelensky were sat together, and we were all thinking, finally, he gets it. He's coming on board. And then you have everything that, then it's Putin's going to Alaska. And it just really seems, have we finally, after 11 months, got to a stage where Europe really understands there's no winning Trump over in any sort of solid manner? You can play to his ego. It's that old thing they say, Trump, last person he spoke to. God.
Well, I don't know, James. I disagree with you there, because I think that the Trump administration has shown genuine moments. Maybe it's not happiness with Zelensky, but it's more impatience with Putin. So we've seen this sort of taco, right? This pendulum of Trump being more willing to engage with the Ukrainians and their plight, if you want. I just read an article in the New York Times a couple of hours ago highlighting that the Trump administration has actually pledged $2 billion to the UN, despite saying that they think the UN's a pile of crap. So Trump seems to say some things, but the administration quietly behind the scenes does do things. And I think at the end of the day, I think he's quite impressed, or maybe it welcomes that Zelensky is willing to consider this, is it free economic zone in the occupied territories? Zelensky has sort of accepted that potential idea, but as long as Russia pulls back as well as Ukraine. And I think that maybe just sort of Trump likes that or welcomes that because it's just progress based on his business style. Or you disagree with that? Michael, I don't know.
I mean, I think ultimately what we have been discussing for, ultimately the last 10 minutes or so is one major realization that we've come to in the last 11 months. There's two realizations. One is Trump's position fluctuates by the day. He is erratic. He is unpredictable. The only way to get to him is to stoke his ego and to give him promises of a possibility of a Nobel Peace Prize. And wherever it is that he achieves, I don't know why he really wants this, but that's ultimately what he's going to get. And the second thing is that ultimately we've been talking about whether this is the hour of Europe. People have been talking about whether the hour of Europe has come since 1990, and they seem to miss it all the time. If anything, they've come to the realization that the United States is no longer the reliable partner that they have always been. Trump may be on board a couple of times, but as you rightly say, Pyotr, his attitude and his position changes. Not only that, but we have to go into the mindset of people like Trump and Putin and Xi Jinping and Modi and others. As far as the current leadership of Europe is concerned, there is not one single individual that gives any sense of confidence and assurity that Europe has any kind of future beyond just simply reacting to what Russia and the United States are going to do. Can either of you tell me that you have any degree of confidence in the leadership of people like Keir Starmer or Macron or Merz for that regard, or Meloni, or I'm talking about national leaders, let alone the people that are running the EU?
Well, I personally remain, I think this is where we can put ourselves on a spectrum, right? In the sense, well, that sounds like you've got sort of autism or something, but Michael, like on the spectrum of like, you're more leaning one way, Michael, James is on the other, and I sort of vacillate in the sense. And I want to believe the best for Europe. I'm cautiously optimistic, but I'm very pragmatic in history, in what we've seen with history, that the Europeans have been so complacent, so free riding of the US for such a long time. There's not much I agree with Trump on, but the fact that the NATO alliance has not been fairly utilized or funded or whatever is 100%. And I don't disagree with that. My problem also is there's a great degree of disparity in Europe. You've got the Polish, the Baltics, Romania, which are very hawkish. They understand what the Kremlin represents in its current form, versus Spain, Italy, other countries which are more laissez-faire. And I think that unless we can find a more comprehensive strategic vision, then it's going to be a problem to implement. I personally, I don't necessarily like Macron. I was having this debate with my father the past week. He hates a lot of the EU bureaucracies, but he lives in it. And he lives in it because he realizes that there is a lot of benefit to the EU if it's not done incorrect, if it's not too bloated. And so my point is that I think I respect Macron because he has at least the balls to say, we need to change something. We need strategic autonomy. We need an EU defense system. I don't like him necessarily because he does represent a lot of things, the old guard, which needs to change. Europe needs to modernize, but he's pushing it whilst other leaders are just like head in sand and not want to react. Keir Starmer, I think, is a joke after his comments about welcoming back this Islamic person who made the most disgusting anti-Semitic comments I think I've ever seen in tweets. And it turns out that he was just a defense lawyer. So yeah, not every leader, but some leaders I have respect for, at least trying to get the conversation going. But that conversation and words doesn't necessarily blend into action, and that's what Europe needs to be doing. And I'm less confident about that. I don't know, James, you're probably more positive than I am.
No, I mean, I think, for regular viewers, they sort of know my views on sort of Europe. And I think, what we're seeing at the moment in many ways is another of these sort of products of Brexit and what a disaster it's been. And I think that Putin's sort of very happily picking off the UK, realizing that, it is in its way still a significant European defence actor, but it's not part of the European Union, and there's been the acrimony there, and I think Starmer is trying to fix it. I've been a little bit more positive about Starmer recently, I have to say, notwithstanding points that you raise, but I think that it has been a very disturbing year to see how Europe has failed to get the message, or again, it keeps coming back. So I do wonder, this view on where Trump sees the world, that he listens to the last person. I just have this sense now that his default position is pro-Putin, and that you're constantly having to talk him away from that. But if you stop for a moment, then he drifts back into it. Quite why that is that sort of for personal reasons he just admires Putin? Is it because Putin, as has been widely suggested, has something on him? Although, my gosh, at this stage, what it could be more than all the other things that we've been seeing.
Netanyahu has more on Trump than Putin ever does.
But James, yeah, I was
well,
say,
all right, but we'll save the Netanyahu-Israel discussion for another point.
Here. You want to talk about who owns my country? It ain't Russia.
Yeah, well, look, but all right, But I think at the moment the question is about why is it that Putin that Trump always seems to go back to Putin, and that there is the real respect as we see it in Trump, and you're constantly having to talk him around. And again, we get back to this point that we were trying to make, which is, how does Europe respond to this? Is it finally getting the message? But what does that mean in real terms? Are we going to see much more European resolve coming out in 2026? More importantly, are we going to see real movement made on the defense element that Europe has been talking about? But again, it seemed that Europe earlier in the year was really sort of finally getting its act together, starting to see about, the defense funds, much closer cooperation. And then that seems to have gone quiet. Now, it might be that it's just gone quiet because media isn't paying quite as much attention to it, or whether that just simply is that Europe got back into its complacent thinking, okay, we've talked Trump around, we can breathe again and relax. And now maybe it's finally got through after 11 months of this nonsense, that you just can't reason with Trump. You will be constantly fighting to try and just massage his ego enough to keep him on side until 2 weeks later he goes and does another thing, which is very, very sort of overtly pro-Russian.
James, I think that there's a different tact there that Europe could employ but don't necessarily do. I think Macron is the best at it. Apparently, I had one guest on who was saying that they text a lot, that Trump and Macron are actually in quite a lot of communication. And I think that's Macron trying to be strategically wise. But also there was the old Prime Minister of Australia, Malcolm Turnbull. There was a famous interview he gave, or the readout of his phone call with Trump when Trump first was in office, 2017. And in sort of the aftermath, Malcolm made it very clear that it's better to sort of ask for forgiveness than it is to ask for permission, in the sense that Trump just will be more receptive almost to you just making the decision, even if it is something that he initially dislikes. He'll be more respectful of the fact that you just sort of stood up to him or disagreed and completely disregarded what he had to say. And that's where I think it leads into this broader point about idealizing Putin. It's more about that strongman thing again, right? That's what we all agree on. Michael, you might see it differently, but for me, it's to engage Trump. It's not to go up there sort of trying to mollycoddle him or sort of, pander to his every whim. It's to meet him on his terms and show him that you're not going to be dictated to.
I think that you hit the nail on the head earlier in our conversation when you mentioned Vance as well. We have to understand that, my country is not run by just Trump, but it is run by a very well put together and very methodically put together coalition of individuals that use Trump as kind of like the lightning rod. He's the charismatic, magnetic one here. But when we look at people like Vance, we look at those that are becoming increasingly vocal within the conservative blogosphere. And there is a major rift, between various segments of MAGA.
It has been brilliant to watch, I have to say, for anyone who hasn't been following it.
But this is ultimately what ends up happening when the movement becomes, so big, and then there's this one particular issue, and it's Israel.
Can I actually say, I don't even think it's a question of a movement becoming big. I think it's just the fact is that the far right is just utterly to their core misanthropic. They have to work to each other. That misanthropic attitudes come to its fore. But it has been, I mean, for anyone watching, the Turning Point USA conference this week has given people a lot of amusement, just seeing how MAGA has turned, the different wings are turning on each other. The very pro-Israel have been turning on the anti-Semites. And it's
the Zionists versus the anti-Semites, sure. But what we see in all of this, I'm looking at bigger picture, right, is that, and I could be wrong on this, but let's be honest, we have 3 more years of Trump. It seems like he's been around for another 20. This is only the first of his second term. And so he is going to have 3 years of cementing, right, a legacy for himself that Vance and others are looking to capitalize on. And so when we bring this back to the geopolitical Weltanschauung, the world outlook, there's really 2 things that we've been talking about. One is the apparent respect that people like Trump have for people like Putin. But we also have to include people like Xi Jinping, among others, strongmen. We're effectively going back in a way to 19th century realpolitik. That's the first point. The second point is, where does Europe fit in all of this? Europe absolutely feels that it is not only still relevant, but it is the only voice of liberal democracy in the world today. And this back and forth about whether we can get Trump on board or whether we can continue to prop up Ukraine and keep it surviving for another 2 weeks, ultimately, I think falls on the realization that, yes, Europe has relied way too much on the United States to carry it this far, and it's time to put up or shut up. As much as I have little regard for Germany's current chancellor, Friedrich Merz, he was right on one thing. I forget whether this was a week ago, 2 weeks ago. I was in the middle of grading papers, ending the semester, and having Christmas. But he said something about the era of trusting America is over. It's done. It's gone. We cannot assume that anymore. Now, the big question is, what will Europe do? Will it position itself as a united EU front within this new multipolar world and act as an independent variable on its own, or will it fragment within itself as well? All right, we talked about the incumbing civil war within MAGA. Europe, we have a number of other issues. We have Macron, whom I will regard in this current cadre of leadership as probably the most outspoken, probably the most upfront person to speak on behalf of Europe. Macron is a national figure. Europe as a geopolitical entity needs to be at the EU level, at the Brussels level. EU leadership right now is widely disregarded as anything other than serious outside of the EU's garden. So, yes, Trump is going to not even give people like Ursula von der Leyen or Kaja Kallas the time of day. Russia looks upon both of them with utter contempt. And even within the EU, the skeptics on Ukraine, and it's more than just simply the Orbáns and the Fizos, and whenever he wants to talk gloom and doom, our favorite guy in Serbia, Aleksandar Vučić, they're all talking about how this is an insane policy that will lead Europe directly into war with Russia. If that's the goal among certain war hawks, okay, then so be it. Let's see where this goes. But if this is simply a way of weaning Europe away from the US, and what that means for, let's say, the future of NATO, or whether the EU will become, or certain EU countries will be more self-sufficient within NATO, remains to be seen. right? It
Well,
really needs to be seen. I'll finish out with just this, and that is they talk a lot. The European leaders talk a lot. Do they have the financial, the structural, and the political capability of actually living up to these claims in the next 5 to 10 years?
Yeah, look, so for me, again, I think we're sort of reshaping similar points we've already covered. But for me, I'm simply, my position is quite simple. I am cautiously optimistic, but also pragmatic about Europe. I see a lot of posts on X about the fact that there was a big one that made the rounds of the EU having standardized the port that you use for charging to USB-C. So everyone from Apple to Samsung and everything has to use the same port. And a lot of pro-MAGAs or just anti-EUists now were sort of making the joke that sort of, so what happens if there's an update? You know, this new policy is out of date, trying to argue that the EU is slow, it's bloated, it doesn't grow. And to be fair, the US economy has grossly grown in the past few years relative to the EU. But for me, I think it's a difference in lifestyle and perception of life priorities. There has never been a desire in Europe to be the same in the US in terms of growth. The expression in America, or in Europe, they live to work. They work to live, versus in America, they live to work, right? And for me, I think that's a good summary of how different communities in the two different continents look at life choices. And so for me, Europe has a lot of things it needs to change. And I do hope that this year was the proper wake up, but I'm not going to get ahead of myself and suddenly think that we're going to see the United States of Europe or a grandiose shift in terms of policy. But we are still talking about a continent of 500 billion people, a GDP per capita, which if measured in purchasing power parity, not nominal as in US dollars or whatever, is similar to that of the United States. We have a very innovative group of people. Human capital is very high. Businesses do want to come to Europe because of the concerns around Trump's recklessness or unpredictability. And so again, I like to believe that the EU has that capacity to do it. And the very last point I'd make before I hand it back to you guys is there was an article, I think in, again, the New York Times or something like that, highlighting how the Baltic foreign minister or someone just came out yesterday saying that actually there is no sign that Putin has any intentions to actually attack Europe. Because their intelligence and whatever has not received any such signs. And that's because I think even if the United States greatly distance itself or decouples from NATO or Europe more broadly, which I don't think it would more broadly because it's still massive markets and that's an interest for Trump, it's still not going to be enough of a magnet for Putin to actually do something, because Europe, yes, it's limited on its military capabilities right now. But again, if it orientates its focus, gets its war footing more in place, you're still talking about a capability, collective capability against one singular country, which is not to snuff at. So again, a lot of this is wishful thinking at the moment, but based on existing and potentials that I think are within reasonable grounds. It's just, again, whether Europe decides to make those priorities or not. And that would be the deciding factor.
I mean, Pyotr, I think you make, it's an interesting point, and obviously there is a lot of discussion, and I'm a little bit more concerned about what Russia is doing in Europe. I think we are potentially too complacent in thinking that Russia's not going to be mad enough to do anything in Europe. But I think if we do see the United States continuing on the path that it's taking, we see the contempt that J.D. Vance has. If anything were to happen to Trump, this is the guy who's going to be taking over. Yeah. Is Europe well enough organized? And, you always end up in, I think that there's a vision that people have that, if Russia attacked Europe, it would be tanks sweeping into Germany, and it won't be. it's far more likely that Russia, and you brought up at the start of it, false flag, something happens with a Russian community in Estonia. And Putin says, right, you know what, I'm going to step in because we will not tolerate this any further. And then you're going to have, my fear is that Europe will be deeply divided. You're not going to have the United States sort of necessarily living up to the Article 5 commitment that it has. Then you're going to get voices in Europe saying, oh, are we really willing to go to war with Russia over this? Maybe we need a bit of diplomacy and everything like that. And there is lurking at the back of all of our minds that threat of nuclear that, Putin has said, which could be, right, okay, if you want to strike back at me, you will be escalating this in ways that are you prepared to do? And I do worry that there will be Europeans who will be saying, oh, maybe we shouldn't. So that is a much more likely scenario that I worry about, rather than the idea of, massed Russian army, which is going to do the old Cold War, sweep into Germany, which was the sort of, it will be much more subtle. And I think the other thing that we have to bear in mind, of course, is that we are also living in a very different world when it comes to conflict and, the concept of hybrid. And we are seeing massive growth there. In all sorts of ways, a real testing of the waters, quite literally in the case that, the sort of talk of Russian submarines coming into sort of UK waters and things like that, the drones that we've been seeing over many European countries. And you start to get into very difficult territory because, if Russia launches a missile and takes out a water treatment plant, that is quite clearly a militaristic problem. Oops, I think we've lost Pyotr there, but hopefully he'll come back in a sec.
Yeah.
That is quite clearly something that requires a military response. But in many ways, you get a much more effective way of doing that through cyber attack, that you can bring down critical infrastructure. And then is it reasonable to respond with a military? You can do far more damage in many ways. One missile, will do a lot of damage, but, a cyber attack can have enormous consequences. And yet any sort of militarized response to that looks like an overreaction. And I think it's a much, much riskier world that we're living in. And our understanding of conflict is changing in ways that I don't think people always quite realize.
No, I agree with you. I think maybe, just a couple of points and then I'll pass it to you, Michael, which is just that I made a video about the Russian vessel, the Yantar, which was floating around British waters, right? And this is part of a broader strategy, which is you don't focus on kinetic conventional warfare. No, that's out of the window. It's subterfuge, it's psychological, it's raids, and in the case of Britain or Western Europe, Northern Western Europe, it's undersea cables, right? How does Russia target and undermine European capabilities? It targets undersea cables or the technological elements that the Europeans rely on to utilize, logistical things from America or whatever, right? But that then leads to the broader thing, which is that the uncomfortable truth is that Russia is arguably at the forefront of modern day warfare, because whilst it has been struggling against Ukraine, it has been adapting and learning. And now we see very clearly with the attacks on Ukraine and the usage of drones, modern warfare is defined by drones now.
Yes.
And they are an integral part of modern conflict. And so Russia is, if anything, better placed to know the most effective way to conduct or be flexible in modern warfare than Europe is. I'm not saying it doesn't have development. Michael, go for it.
Well, I mean, this goes once again to the two diametrically opposed narratives that constantly are used against Russia by Europe and the West. Russia is either a teetering economy that's on the brink of collapse and is a Potemkin village that uses military means to bluff its obviously internal rot, or it's the barbaric horde that's going to take over Europe and convert everybody to communists. You got to pick one or the other. Okay, it's either, Russia is in Ukraine stealing machine parts for their motorcycles, or they are at the peak of military and warfare capabilities. And if we don't do something, they're going to just completely take over. Pick one, guy. I'm not just you, but just pick one. Russia.
Well, I mean, there are comments saying pretty much the same.
About is Russia going to invade Europe? This is a country that takes weeks to slog through a third-rate town in eastern Ukraine. So the minute they take Kharkov, okay, we can start talking about that.
Yeah, but Michael, look, I mean, it again, I mean, you get to the point that, as has been pointed out, the most effective military in Europe now is the Ukrainian military. They have learned a lot. In fact, it would be far easier for Russia to be taking on practically any other armed force in Europe. And all this is predicated on, can we trust Article 5 to actually mean something, not just from the United States, but I suspect also from other European countries, which is a grave concern. And we can also talk, it's not just Hungary, it's not just Slovakia, it's the fact that Spain has the view, well, this is not our problem in many ways. We're sitting at the other side of the continent, be that as it may. But I think the idea that you either look at Russia as dilapidated and can't do anything economically, or that it's a great military threat. I think, I think you can marry those two perspectives together, because there has been, and Pyotr, looks a lot at the Russian economy, there has been a drastic refocusing of the Russian economy.
I also would say
on a military basis.
I do disagree with you, because I feel like you missed what I said. Like, I made it quite clear that Russia wouldn't be doing it in a conventional sense. What it's doing in Ukraine is conventional kinetic warfare, which it clearly isn't great. But it wouldn't attack. No, of course it's not going to invade all of Europe. There's an old video game, Call of Duty Modern Warfare 3 from 2011, for those of you watching who remembers that. But basically, classic. I remember, you game in the way, James, I can imagine. Hang on. There's a story in there. No, but the plot of the campaign is that Russia launches a mass, Eastern invasion across all of Europe. It's in Paris, it's in London, it's in Rome, it's in Warsaw. That's complete bollocks. Of course, Russia's not going to do it. But the point that I'm trying to make, Michael, is that Russia has the military flexibility to leverage non-conventional means of warfare.
Yes, I'm in agreement with. Yes, that I'm in agreement with. I mean, look, they've been fighting for what's going to be 4 years. Within IR studies, we have something called learning theory. The longer you are at war, the more your country adapts, the more that your country is able to respond much quicker. The Russian army, whatever it is you want to refer to it as in Ukraine, has adapted tremendously. The first year and a half, remember, James, you mentioned this, right?
It was a lot chaos. Of things.
Honestly, I think it was two things. A, it was overextension, and B, they were still fighting with an army that had not been adapted to all of this. Now, all of a sudden, it's the slow grind. And it's the hold your positions and just, take out any Ukrainian counteroffensive forces one by one. They're making advances. They are making advances in Ukraine's east and south. They are doing this again. Ukraine is losing. They've lost Pokrovsk, they've lost Mirnograd. Take what I just translated on my channel a couple of days ago. Kupiansk is now either completely taken or it is about to be taken. There is talk about another major offensive around the Kharkov area in 2026. And the very simple thing that Putin has said is that if we cannot achieve what we are seeking at the negotiating table, we'll do it on the battlefield. All right, we will just simply do it on the battlefield. And Europe can wither and dither. They can talk about 5-year plans. They can talk about what would happen if Russia was to. Personally, I think that we're all in agreement here that no, we're not going to see tanks rolling into Poland. We are not going to be seeing that. But what we will see is probably cyber warfare, or better yet, political warfare.
No, I agree. I think
the big thing, the one thing that we also have to look at, and this has been a mainstay in one of the major positions, one of the main ideologies of Russian foreign policy, at least since 2007. But it has absolutely become solidified since 2014, right? And that is, if Russia has a soft power, it is an alternative to that of Western liberalism. Traditional identities, cultural, sovereign democracy, civilizational realism, whatever it is that you want to call it. Trump sees this, according to Russia. Trump, Vance, the MAGA movement see this. They see that this is the future of geopolitics for the next couple of decades. Europe is clinging on to this idea of liberalism, which has multiple holes in it because they speak of every crime against humanity that Russia has committed in Ukraine, but turn blind eye and deaf ear to what's happening in Palestine. Anti-Russian rallies can almost be condoned, supported by European leaders, and yet you say that you are in favor of a free Palestine that risks your arrest and censorship in these very same countries. Russia's position is simply let Europe crumble from within. Let Europe argue within each other, between the people that are running the country saying we need to prepare for an eventual war with Russia. Let's bring back conscription. Our grandchildren are going to, die for Ukraine. And a lot of other people are saying bollocks to that. Why? And all that needs to happen is let that play out in the polls. Let it play out in the polls. Let the AFDs of every country continue to gain, if not governmental control.
Michael, isn't this why we need to be so worried?
It's difficult to form any coalition around it.
No, but that's precisely the point that I was making. Why I am not so complacent about what Russia could do, because I do see the divisions in Europe. I hear, we talk about it. You just look at the comments coming up. People, these guys are warmongers. It's like there is a substantial body in Europe which just simply say, Ukraine, not really our issue. Why should we be, we're not going to go and fight, Russia and everything like that. And Putin is extremely adept at exploiting that.
Yes.
And building up that sentiment and things. This is hybrid warfare being played out before our very eyes, because you will get people who will be going on social media and making these comments. Why Putin's not our enemy, Zelensky is utterly corrupt, and why are we fighting for Ukraine? This is a terrible country and stuff like that. Then you get all the bots that come in and give it all the likes, and all these people who are sort of slightly sympathetic to that view then start thinking, oh well, I'm not on my own. This is a commonly held belief. It's a huge problem that we're facing.
I think that we frame it differently, but this is where I also gravitate towards Michael to a degree on the viability of supporting Ukraine all the way, because to me, we have to consider the cold reality. And this is why I'm not popular amongst communities of the Ukrainian side sometimes, because ideologically, morally speaking, I support Ukraine's obviously sovereignty and independence, but I'm also pragmatically conscious of what it risks to Europe more broadly if we are so intent on spending all that money on just Ukraine's plight at the expense of our own, which Russia can exploit sometimes. So I'm hoping that, a greater situation which is more favorable can develop. But Russia does have the momentum on the battlefield, however incremental it may be. And these false flags, as we started out the conversation, Michael, James, right? Because the Trump administration, even more than just Trump, lap them up, especially if they're sort of, reinforced by Modi or other heads of state saying that this was a problematic development or extremely concerning, then it really goes against Ukraine's cause and by extension Europe. So I'm very cognizant of that.
Okay, so I mean, we sort of talked around a lot on Russia, so and Ukraine. So I mean, I think what would and I would think it'd be really good to sort of touch on maybe a couple of other subjects, because it has been a truly momentous year. So I guess the sort of the questions and sort of put to Michael when he gets back, where do you now see the Ukraine war going in 2026? What are we going to see some sort of peace agreement? Where is Europe also going to be going on this in 2026?
So I think that I would answer your question by distinguishing between what I'd like to see, or what I hope, but also what I think is perhaps more realistic. So on the one hand, I think that realistically, or morally speaking, I'd love to see Europe genuinely stepping up these ideas of voluntary conscription, which Michael criticizes. I mean, I'm not exactly keen to see Europe remilitarizing to such an extent. But if you actually look at the statistics, more than 70% of both the French and the German populations, if just as an example, support the idea of reintroducing voluntary conscription. So the idea that being more militarized, or whatever, if that's the right word, isn't some kind of forced imposition. Keep in mind that a lot of what we read on X, and this is for all of you watching, they are the loudest but minority. It's often the people on the fringes who have the loudest voices, but don't necessarily represent the silent majority. And in this case, you have a lot of loud vocal critics of Europe, or saying that Europe is outraged and this, that, the other. And I'm not saying that there aren't countries like Europe, like Hungary, like Italy, which are a little bit more skeptical. But in essence, when the Europeans agreed this $90 billion loan, which is pivotal, I think, for next year, there was no distinction at all. There was 27 countries in unanimous agreement about it. Okay, there was touch and go with the Hungarians, but there was agreement amongst the countries about supporting Ukraine. Even
with some carve-outs for the Hungarians and the Slovaks. But
in essence, they agreed to it. So when really push comes to shove, I still like to think that consensus can be found. And so if this can continue, I think it depends more on what the Kremlin does and what Trump's trying to do, as that will dictate how Europe behaves. But additionally, as Michael has said, and you have said, James, in your own way, Europe needs to get ahead of the curve, get out in front.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I liked what Macron said. I think he said those words exactly, which was, he was trying to say we need to talk to Putin, not because we want to legitimize what he's doing, but because we need to stop reacting to what he says. And we need to proactively engage with Putin ahead of what he tries to. So I think next year is not going to be the end of the conflict, but I think you might see a pause, but I think it won't last long, simply because there is an unwillingness really by the Russians to achieve that. I think that the situation for Trump is going to change the closer we get to the midterms. The US economy is, okay, it's doing pretty well, but his popularity isn't. People don't like what he's doing with Venezuela. They don't like how close he is with Netanyahu and the idea of restriking Iran. He isn't doing what he said, which would be to, completely be isolationist, America first, the infighting in America. So I think Trump's going to be in an increasingly tough position as we approach the midterms, because I think he's going to lose his majority somewhere, and then that will obviously curtail his influence, the power dynamic. So, yeah, I do think we're going to see some shifts yesterday. I do think we're going to see some significant policy upscaling of militarization in Europe, and a concerted effort to shift in Europe. But does it mean the end of the conflict? Definitely not. Maybe a temporary ceasefire? Yes, probably.
No. Okay. So, Michael, we were just discussing.
Yeah, sorry about
trying
that.
to bring it round to where we see things going in 2026. So, just trying to sort of just give a bit more structure to what we've been talking about. Where do you see it going? What happens in Ukraine conflict in 2026? Yeah.
So sorry about that. That was someone came to the door, and I needed to answer that. Life goes on here. So,
Michael, your volume's quite low. High. Just there's a bit of feedback. Just so you.
Oh, sorry about that.
Okay. No, just for listeners.
So 2020. I mean, Ukraine is ultimately becoming a back burner issue in the United States. We don't talk about it simply because we are, Venezuela. Is that going to happen or not? The big thing,
which I'd like to talk a little bit about.
Yeah, but the big thing, look, the big thing is Palestine. The big thing is Netanyahu. The big thing is Israel. The Gaza. This is the thing. Ukraine is it's no longer a front and center issue. So whether there is a ceasefire, whether there is an end to hostilities, I mean, sure, there are some elected officials that are making unbelievably large amounts of money off of the war in Ukraine, and they will continue to do so. Let's be, very, very honest here, is that most of my elected officials don't really care one way or the other as long as their stock portfolio goes up. And that's just the bottom line. When it comes to midterm elections, never underestimate the Democratic Party to absolutely fuck up another opportunity at capitalizing off of Trump's unpopularity. I mean, in any other country, the Republican Party would probably get 5-6% of the vote, especially if this were a proportional representative system. But in my country, they basically run the show. And that is largely because the opposition does more to aid Trump than to actually oppose him. So I'm a little bit more pessimistic, seeing that the midterm elections can go a number of ways. I could be very wrong. I could be very, very wrong. But we also have to take one factor into account as far as the Democratic Party is concerned. And that is that there is more of a backlash by would-be Democratic voters for candidates that take AIPAC money. This is now a major thing. Are you an AIPAC stooge? If you are, I'm not voting for you. That's it. Genocide is the red line. And the Democratic Party,
which wing? I mean, we were talking a little bit about the split in MAGA between the pro-Israel voices and the anti-Semitic voices. Where does that play out?
Well, the pro-Palestine, the anti-genocide supporters that are increasingly younger voters, and the older, liberal.
I think that's an interesting thing, isn't it? Because it actually splits in three different ways. There are the on the right, you've got the fierce pro-Israel, and on the left, actually. I mean, of course, within the Democratic Party as well. But on the right, it does seem that, those who are opposed are just simply, anti-Semitic, whereas those on the left opposed are pro-Palestinian.
I'm not exactly sure. I wouldn't necessarily lump everybody on the right.
I mean, there is obviously a crossover between being pro-Palestinian and being anti-Semitic. But
we got to be very careful about that word at this point, because leveling any criticism of Israel as anti-Semitic now is almost.
I completely oppose that view on things. But
real serious discussion here. I mean, for God's sake, when Miss Rachel is considered to be anti-Semitic, I would like to think that the Zionist lobby, which has unbelievably large amounts of money, power, and influence, would be a little bit better in its propaganda. It's just pathetic boomer propaganda, where any criticism leveled against a country that has openly, unapologetically, unabashedly said that certain people are subhumans and do not deserve to live in this state. Any criticism of that is considered to be anti-Semitic, and to link anti-Semitism with anti-Zionism, it's a shitty argument, but it's the only one they.
No, but Michael, I think we can, without wanting to get down into the weeds on this argument. I think it's very clear what Israel did in Palestine amounts to genocide by any understanding of the term. Most scholars who work on genocide would say that it fits the definition, and I certainly believe that is the case. But at the same time, we can't ignore the fact that there are a lot of people who just have patently anti-Semitic views in all of this. But I agree with you. I find it very, very troubling. The equation of taking a very strong position on what Israel has done in Gaza and a genocide it's been committed, and then just simply saying that everyone who makes that criticism is anti-Semitic. And I push back very strongly on that.
Mhm.
I reject it fundamentally, but look, I think, let's not maybe get carried away with going too much onto this, because I think, the key discussion we want to be having is, where, we've moved on to the midterms. There's a bit of a look ahead in 2026. So we talked about, where Europe is going, but where the United States is going. How much will that change? What will that change in foreign policy?
Mm-hmm.
If you suddenly wake up in the morning, following the midterms in November, and, the Republicans have taken a real beating. I mean, I think, taking on board the comment that you made, that don't believe that that's necessarily going to happen for all sorts of reasons, but not least of all because the Democrats have this unparalleled ability to mess it up for themselves.
Yes. It's hard to say, because when it comes to foreign policy, there's very little difference between Republicans and Democrats. And what we've also found,
well, there would traditionally, I think, foreign policy in most countries does tend to be a bipartisan issue, but surely with what we're seeing with Trump, I mean, if we just dissect all the different things that he's been doing, but there surely has got to be clear blue water between the Republicans and Democrats, and what would have been more moderate international.
I mean, I think that probably the biggest difference would be in the U.S.'s relationship with Europe, including Ukraine. When it comes to Israel-Palestine, there's no difference on that. When it comes to Latin America, I have to say, it's amazing how the Monroe Doctrine is still really indoctrinated into American foreign policy. How dare a Latin American country actually engage in a free election and not elect a fascist? How dare they? So hence, this is what we're seeing when it comes to Colombia, Venezuela, Chile, among others. I mean, I just find it, the Trump administration obviously is playing much more into, I think, this idea of regionalism. Each major country has their own region of sphere of influence. And they just feel that Latin America should absolutely be in America's sphere. Whether or not we do something with Venezuela remains to be seen. We talk about small level attacks here, missile attacks on this tanker, this ship, that ship, sabotage in Europe regarding Ukraine, either on the Russian side or on the Ukrainian side. Are we going to see full scale military conflict? That I don't think. I honestly feel that one could say that we are already in multiple wars, but we are in psychological, cyber warfare, low-level warfare, political warfare. Drone fighting is now one of the major elements of this. These things can be produced on the cheap. People are talking about AI becoming more. Look, I've seen Terminator enough times. I don't want that happening. But you get the point. I guess going back to the where things what we see as far as 2026. With the United States, midterm elections are going to be in November, so there is much campaigning that will take place, and there is much that is going to happen in between that time as well. Make no mistake about it. Trump has made a number of major enemies in the United States, far more than he did in his first term, except for the idea that he has now put himself in a position to rely on people within law enforcement, the security apparatus, to demobilize and effectively nullify any real organized opposition against him. The Democratic Party is still led by what I would call paleo-liberals who desperately want to go back to 1993, but they don't represent the changing attitudes, the changing socioeconomic grievances among Americans that are now under 35. So we could see some shifts, here or there. What we can also point out, and again, I don't want to get too optimistic about this, right? We had a major upset election in New York City with, the mayor. Now, New York City is a separate thing. Please, please, please do not think that New York is a representation of the rest of the country. And we also have to understand that Mamdani's two opposition figures, Cuomo was just a reprehensible, human being. Curtis, I like Curtis. I feel a little bad for Curtis, but at the same time, he was backstabbed by his own party in favor of Cuomo. So there's a lot of things that are up in the air. What we can also see with Mamdani is that he realizes that in order to get through maybe even a quarter of his policies, he has to compromise on the other three quarters. And he's already disappointing some people on the left. Whom, I am on the left as well, but I understand that in order to be mayor of New York, you need to make nice with Albany and you need to make nice with Washington. So you can't really get everything you want.
Politics is going to be that relevant in foreign policy next year. Mamdani may well have won, but I don't see him being as much of an impact on foreign policy. I think Trump's biggest concerns are still going to be Ukraine, near a border with Venezuela. What I find interesting about Venezuela, if we pivot to that briefly, is that Trump has this sort of idealization or happiness about some strongmen, but not Maduro. He has a absolute hatred for Maduro, even though Maduro is a wannabe strongman like Putin, like some others, right? But I think very much, Michael, your point is astute about America wanting to return to this Monroe Doctrine, the sort of Theodore Roosevelt kind of spheres of influence, great power. Russia has its own, as in Europe. China has its own in Asia, excuse me. What I'm curious about is obviously who starts fiddling around in Africa more, therefore. But when it comes to Venezuela, definitely we're going to see, I think, greater escalation. A lot has moved. In 8 weeks? We've gone from occasional targeting of boats to now the military is just all out intercepting or acquiring maritime vessels, tankers. I believe I read a report saying that Trump is considering just a land-based operation to sabotage certain places on the port, as in ports and access points of Venezuela. It's like, why is this guy claiming to be America first, or as he sort of suggested, isolationist? I don't think Trump was ever isolationist completely. I think he was more just full-blown nationalist, but sort of that got warped up in the broader family and dialogue of MAGAs being isolationist. But it's not possible. Clearly, Trump wants to be active on the world stage, but in a very transactional sense. Whilst you've got what they consider to be the core, hard, true MAGAs, who will be 100% neo-isolationist, and that means no engagement whatsoever. While Trump is a little bit more aware that it means that. And this brings me to something which I think is quite interesting. That was the NSS, the National Security Strategy. I've done a lot of coverage of this on my channel in the past few weeks. But I think that was really interesting because whilst it's not necessarily like a hardcore illustration of policy, I think it gives us a clear indication of how not Trump necessarily sees it. He certainly didn't write it or read it, let alone he's cleaned it. And I think it goes back to what we were talking about of the broader Trump administration, about Vance, about Rubio, about whoever it is that is around him, right? They're the ones that I think we should be watching as much next year than just Trump, because they are the ones. Rubio, with his Cuban background, is really, really intent on doing something about Venezuela. He's quite good at retaining composure about certain issues, but as soon as it's about Venezuela, you can see just how personally agreed he is. So I think Vance is. I hate Vance more than I do Trump, to be honest. And what did he say in an interview with one of the networks? I think he said, if it means some kind of territorial acquisition or something, about Greenland, right? Something Greenland's back in the conversation, and he's basically threatening to annex Greenland now. I think Trump doesn't really care about it as much again. He's just sort of like, well, we want it, we'll buy it off you. But Vance is letting it genuinely, I'm a bit concerned, would actually try to do something there. So I think next year is definitely going to be an escalation in Venezuela. But of course, this brings us back to Iran and what's happening in Iran. James, I don't know if you have any other comments you want to jump in, but I thought it might be worth touching upon what's happening in Iran at the moment.
Yeah, well, I mean, in many ways, it's incredible to think that we saw a major conflict in the Middle East this year. I mean, it's almost been completely forgotten now. One that, was, it really escalated. So we've known for many years that, this proxy war between Iran and Israel, it came fully out into open in what was a major conflict. And remembering, the decapitation strategy of Israel was incredibly successful. And then that culminated in the United States bombing Iran. And I think it is a really, really interesting situation in all sorts of ways, because it does seem that Iran has changed its tone in interesting ways, that it you would rather expect that it would come out and it would be sort of, even upping up the rhetoric against the United States, sort of, not confronting Washington directly militarily, but simply, sort of going back to a lot of the old language. And yet it seems that Iran hasn't been doing that. But we have seen in the past few days Trump issuing a very clear warning that if Iran starts developing its nuclear program again, the United States will act again. I think what's going on in Iran is fascinating. There are lots of interesting reports that the regime now is in full survival mode, for good and bad. So on the bad side, it's been rounding people up. Executions have been rising. On the good side, there's been a lot of reports that you haven't got the religious authorities out on the street arresting women who aren't wearing, headscarves and stuff like that. So Iran, I think, is in a really, really interesting position at the moment. And obviously this is incredibly important because, it ties in with what's going on in Lebanon, for example. What has been really interesting over the past year is to see the way that the Lebanese have wanted to try and crack down on Hezbollah, but just can't seem to do it. And the implications of that. Hamas, I think it's really quite curious that we aren't paying a lot of attention to what's going on in Gaza now. That this was such a big issue. Then we had this peace plan, which was really actually half-baked. It got through. There's been a little bit of progress, but it's gone quiet. I mean, it's just not getting the coverage. But there were a lot of reports that Hamas were back out on the streets of Gaza, reasserting themselves. You've got the Houthi in Yemen, where all this falls into place with Iran. So I think, we need to be paying a lot more attention to Iran and what's going on there. That this is a wounded regime. But it's not one that's down and out by any stretches.
Well, I think, Mike, James, that why now, and this sort of bleeds into what we were talking about a little bit, was how Iran is in look, the economy is shot. The economy is in absolutely dire straits. What's different about these protests that I learned from some people on the ground there yesterday in the next space was that these are protests that have been emerging in the cities and specifically in Tehran. Well, different to the ones in, say, 22, and it was Mahsa Amini and the Green Revolution. Those were more rural areas. And so the fact that the people in the cities are leading the developments, and that there was a university where the students were surrounded a couple of days ago, it shows you there's a lot more willingness to be that vocal in the biggest areas where the security forces, the law enforcement exist, which I do think is a notable difference. Do I suddenly think that the Iranian regime is going to collapse? No, they're not in a good position, but it's like the same with the Russian economy, right? We're claiming every 20 minutes the Russian economy is going to collapse, and 4 years later it's still there. I do think it's not in a good condition, but I do think it's not hour zero or whatever, minute zero. So I think if this continues, this could be the first big geopolitical international story of next year. Could be the protests in Iran, because we know these can go on for a long time. They're slow burners. But this leads me to the broader point, which I wanted to bring you guys' thoughts of, was obviously Netanyahu has been in the US and they are talking about the situation in Gaza to an extent, but obviously there's rumblings and claims that maybe this is the two looking to exploit this poor situation in Iran to their advantage, to continue to target Iran. I mean, it's not too far-fetched for me. There are suggestions that the Iranians have been rebuilding some of their nuclear facilities. So could we see another Operation Rising Lion or whatever it was called in June, right? Could we see something like that happening again?
Sure, Netanyahu has absolutely no problems diverting attention away from the internal issues that are plaguing Israel. We've avoided Israel. We've avoided the Israeli economy. We've avoided Israeli internal politics and how this country is still managed to string together over the past 3 years. Netanyahu will absolutely do whatever it takes for him to stay in power. And Iran it's a punchable country as far as Trump is concerned. Can they do it? Probably not. Do they have the capability? It would be incredibly costly and risky to do so. If they feel that they could somehow puncture the regime in Tehran, just be careful what you wish for, because there is absolutely no love for the Israeli government or the Trump administration within ordinary Iranian sentiment. I mean, Americans, there's a different story as individuals are concerned. But in my opinion, yeah, I think that as far as what James was saying about what is it? The government, the regime is in survival mode. I think it's in transition mode. There's a couple of things that we need to bring up here, and that is Northern Iran today, you can go to, and you'll be hard pressed to find women in headscarves. You will find many just effectively living like, modern cosmopolitan individuals here. And we're not just talking about just women. We're talking about, men, the way that they dress, this, that, the other thing. The big issue is the religious element, the morality police. You don't see them on the streets anymore, at least not in northern Iran. Isfahan, different story, Qom's, the religious cities. But this is now entering into Tehran as well. And so the government, which has been led ostensibly by a reformist, Pereskian, is in a position where additional reforms, additional forms of modernization are going to come at a cost. Is going to come at a cost for the socio-cultural conservatism that has defined the country since 1979. And there's no rolling back of any of these reforms. Once you reform, it is incredibly costly and risky to renege on them. And yeah, this is what will bring protests into the streets. The way that I see
the fundamental infrastructure problems, the water shortages.
Yes. So the country
causing absolute devastation, and there seems to be a lot focus that could be the thing that really tips things.
Oh, it's the small things. It's going to be the small things: water shortage, electricity, the cost of living. These are the things. These are ultimately the things that bring people out into the streets. These are the things that are legitimate grievances that can obviously snowball into something else. Will Iran, if left to its own devices, continue to modernize and reform? Perhaps, right? Perhaps. We don't know. But all it takes is another confrontation with Israel to unify the population again with their own government. So if there is any attempt at trying to initiate, first of all, I hope I'm wrong. I really hope that I'm wrong. But any attempt at trying to initiate regime change in Iran is going to be just a disaster in the making. So let's just hope that it doesn't get to that at all.
I really don't think that the I don't know. The situation in Israel is, I think it's pretty clear how you feel about the whole situation, Michael, at this point. But I don't see the relevance of it, to be honest with you. The only notable thing I can think out of there was Netanyahu trying to get the president or whoever it was to give him a free pass out of this shit show that he still faces in the lawsuits and etc. Right? I get that, but in the grander scheme of things for next year, I don't see the relevance. I've stopped talking about Gaza just because I couldn't get through the toxicity of it. The vitriol on both sides was beyond anything I've ever seen. And, you know, as much as I feel the plight of the Gazan people, the situation is untenable at the moment. And I really cannot see a long-term solution which benefits them, whilst obviously considering everything else that involves Israel. So right now, when I look at that, I always try to put it in the context of the broader Middle East, because obviously Gaza was the powder keg that triggered so many events that we've seen, including Syria. Something I did just want to touch on very quickly was Syria, because it's been exactly over a year since Assad's fall. And I'm not, well, yeah, we've completely.
I mean, you know, we're now in Trump time, so it just seemed that Assad fell like years ago. But of course, you're absolutely right. It's only been a year.
Story, and I saw a very interesting post on Instagram a couple of days ago about the new currency that they're bringing out. I'm not getting ahead of myself. I still remain skeptical, or a healthy degree of skepticism over the leader, because his past is not exactly ideal. But it does seem like Syria is trying to encourage more FDI. The Americans removed it off their terrorist list. So Syria is really, at least on the face value, if we take it at face value, trying to sort of be seen as a constructive member of Western orientated member of society. So that's worth considering. But then, of course, we had the escalations between India and Pakistan, the single biggest airstrike exchanges and whatever in May, which we've all sort of moved on from. And that was an illustration of escalations in one of the hottest zones, but also, which then I kind of wanted to get your thoughts on China and Taiwan in a second. But like, we also had an illustration of Chinese hardware, military aircraft being used in the field for the first time, which the West, and I have some military colleagues of mine who told me just how much they were watching this, seeing what the jets, or Chinese jets, were doing in aerial combat. And because we've seen China's military elevation and expenditure and modernization and stuff, so there's so many. And of course, actually, before I forget, Sudan is
overlooked. The world's worst humanitarian crisis at the moment. I mean, it is shocking what's going on in Sudan, and yet barely gets a look in. You're absolutely right. It deserves so much more attention. But Pyotr, also, I mean, you know, a function of the world that we live in at the moment. But I think, you know, what you brought up about South Asia is, you know, obviously it's going to be very trite to say it's an incredibly important region that just simply doesn't really get enough attention in Western media. But there are some really significant developments that are taking there, and a potential redrawing of a lot of the old certainties that we had come to expect. So we could see, obviously, the India-Pakistan. We know that that's been an issue that's been on the agenda for, you know, well, we're talking sort of well over 60 years now, more than that, 80 years. And the legacy of partition, Kashmir, we have all of that. But what I think has been really fascinating to watch is the way that we are starting to see a shift away from, for example, India, Bangladesh, which traditionally had a close relationship, depending on how you sort of talk to people. I mean, many in Bangladesh would see it as almost a neo-colonial relationship. Others would say, no, this was genuinely based on the fact that there was gratitude in Bangladesh for India's role in securing its independence. For anyone who might not be aware, you know, Bangladesh and Pakistan were, well, East and West Pakistan until Bangladesh broke away at the start of the 1970s. And Bangladesh and Pakistan had very cool relations for a long time. They're starting to warm up. Pakistan is reaching out to Bangladesh at the same time. We have tensions between Bangladesh and India over Sheikh Hasina, the former leader of Bangladesh, who is now holed up in India, and India refuses to hand her over. Of course, we saw the incredible pictures earlier, well, in the summer, that Modi is furious with Trump and the tariffs, and believes that Trump has just acted in incredibly bad faith. And what do we next see? Pictures of Modi going to Shanghai Cooperation Organization summit, and that sort of very, very close relationship with Xi and Putin. It really, really is, as I say, something that I think is worth watching, what's happening in South Asia, amongst everything else that we've been talking about. But again, isn't getting perhaps the look in Western media that it really should be getting.
Yeah, no, there's so much. Michael, you've been quiet for a minute listening. I'm sure you've got some thoughts.
Well, among other things, I'm just checking the comments. There's a lot of comments that want us to focus on the fact that Somaliland just got a major.
I will come to that. Can I just, because I'm seeing a lot.
I'm going to do it at the end.
It seems to be the topic du jour of all the things that we're talking about.
Somaliland gets recognition from Israel. Congratulations. This is, how parastates basically devolve, and become frozen conflicts in the world.
All right. Well, look, can I jump in on this one? I actually also I've got a super chat that I'd like to bring up as well. To answer, but look,
to all of them.
The Somaliland recognition really did come as a surprise. Not necessarily that. It hasn't been talked about. All the speculation has been on the United States and Somaliland. Right. So for anyone who might not know a little bit of the background of Somaliland, it's something that I've often spoken about on my channel. It's a fascinating story. So essentially, this is another one of those colonial hangovers. So the northern part of Somalia is an area called Somaliland, which had been under British colonial control, and the southern part had been under Italian colonial control. And they united briefly. British Somaliland declared independent, became an independent state for about 5 or 6 days before Italian Somaliland became independent. Yeah. They then merged. But it was a really unhappy union. The North felt that it was always overlooked by the South. The North is dominated. Somalia's
Somaliland is actually wealthier than Somalia.
Somaliland is actually
it's a really interesting story, because Somalia, and I'll include Somaliland in this for this purpose, is considered to be one of the most ethnically homogenous countries in Africa. But that covers up a very, very interesting clan structure that exists in the country. And in the north, in what was British Somaliland, you've got a clan called the Isaac, which dominated. And so there is a sort of a clan, not ethnic, but a clan-based element to this whole story. So there's about 5 or 6 major clans in Somalia, and then you've got sub-clans and sub-clans of sub-clans. But essentially, you've got this northern bit, which had been British, which is majority held by this one clan. And it was really unhappy under Somalia, under Siad Barre, who was dictator for many years. And then he fell at the end of the Cold War. He lost his support. He fell. Somalia collapsed into civil war. And Somaliland took the opportunity to take back its independence, and has been fighting ever since a diplomatic battle for recognition without any success.
Well, they're not going to be recognized, are they?
This is the interesting thing, because
if I may jump in, Jake, the Ethiopians said in 2024 that
they were going to recognize. Nothing came of it.
They got a port access through Somaliland, but there was the MOU, or Memorandum of Understanding, which never led anywhere because the Ethiopians didn't want to rock the boat too much with other countries. Somalia is not in, it's in disarray. The Sudanese, the Kenyans were all putting pressure on Ethiopia not to do that, especially considering, I don't know why there's a car alarm, sorry everybody.
Did we lose him?
I don't know. I will jump back in on the story of Somaliland, and so they've been pursuing this campaign for diplomatic recognition. Now, what makes it really quite interesting is that there's two facets of this. The African Union actually staged it's had a sort of an investigation into the situation and said that, look, in actual fact, there is a good case for Somaliland to have its independence. I'm just continuing on the story. But the view has been that it's for African states to make this decision. Somaliland also actually has very close relations with Britain, the former colonial power, and the United States. So we've had British government officials have meetings with Somaliland leaders quite openly. When Gavin Williamson was Defence Secretary, for example, he went to Hargeisa and had meetings there. But Britain has always held back from recognition. I think it might be sympathetic to it, but has always taken the view that it's got to be for African countries to do that. And so Ethiopia's potential recognition was going to be significant in all of this, but that then fell through. And then there was all the talk that Trump was preparing to recognize Somaliland, and there's been excitement all this year that that's going to happen. It hasn't happened. It seems to have gone a bit quiet in recent months. And then bang, on Friday, we had Israel announce. Now, for anyone who's been following this really closely, and as you can probably tell, I have been, there was actually a Security Council meeting yesterday on it. And it was very telling that the United States, while saying it wasn't going to recognize or that there had been no change in its position, refused to condemn Israel over this. Now, Michael, I know you'd say, well, surprise, surprise, but it was very telling that Washington's position on this was that, well, Israel has every right to conduct its diplomacy as it sees fit.
But James, could we therefore say that this whole notion of Trump floating the idea and then suddenly Israel actually goes ahead and does it, was that
paving the way? That I think is what a lot of us observers are now wondering.
Yes, that's the whole point. Plus, look, we need to understand that recognition of non-sovereign territory like Somaliland or Abkhazia or South Ossetia or even Kosovo, for that matter, right? Got to bring that one up. Is that it becomes effectively a frozen conflict. It becomes disputed territory. Ethiopia recognizing Somaliland is ultimately nothing. It really does. It doesn't do much unless Ethiopia is willing to defend it against Somali military incursion. Israel recognizing Somaliland is something that, yes, the United States doesn't have to do anything anymore because the United States operates through Israel to do a lot of its foreign policy in the region. So, I mean,
Michael, I think we need to be...
Israel's recognition is a great way to eventually dump the Palestinians in and get rid of.
There is a qualitative difference.
There's also, places where Israel can set up military bases to strike the Houthis. This is not out of any kind of real love for self-determination. Recognizing a parastate. Recognizing a parastate is a fair point, strategic reasons.
I think,
but Michael, I think there is a huge difference between Israel recognizing Somaliland and the United States recognizing Somaliland. We know, the great power recognition is the single most important factor in legitimizing breakaway territories. Not altogether. Even now, you brought up Kosovo, even with the support of Britain, France, the United States, only half the world, actually fewer than half the members of the UN recognize Kosovo these days. And equally, Russian support for Abkhazia and South Ossetia, we're talking 5 countries around the world recognize them.
Yes.
So it's not, but it is a substantial element.
But I would say,
and I think that, what you say on Ethiopian recognition could have been groundbreaking for Somaliland had it not been for the fact that it was so nakedly transactional. It was Ethiopia was making this promise in order to get port access. If Ethiopia had come along and said, listen, we have evaluated the situation and we believe that there is a good case and we are going to go out and lobby African countries for it, then I think, as I say, on the back of this African Union report, which is really crucial in the story, it's a very little known element of the story, that the African Union had sent a fact-finding mission and said, look, we don't like the idea of messing around with borders in Africa. But in the case of Somaliland, there is a case for recognition because of its prior independence. Now, prior independence doesn't give you an automatic right under international law to reclaim it, as Scotland has found out. And for all the Texans out there, that's the problem that you face if you want to make a push for a break from the US. But it does have a bearing on this story. But the argument has been it's an African decision. And I think Israel storming in like this and doing that will have actually, I think, harmed Somaliland's case in many ways. The United States might push now. It's a lot is going to depend on what Washington does and how much heft, if it is willing to recognize, it's going to put behind it. But Israel on its own, I'd say it's actually probably.
I think we need to take a step back here and also sort of allow a bit more dialogue, which is that simply, Michael, firstly, I think you make one good point, or rather, I agree with you. Somewhere for Israel to put some stuff,
which is exactly what we know it's all about. Yeah,
well, I think it's very much about that, but also I don't think this is going to be global redefining geopolitical event.
No, sorry to all the commenters who wanted, you sent on a question that I'm fascinated in, but I didn't realise in the greater scheme of what we could be talking about, it's not up there.
And worked on African issues firsthand.
I
knew that this is something that I care a lot about. But we've also got another unidentified or unrecognised country that is being claimed at the moment, which is the RSF's control of Darfur and the larger provinces in Western Sudan. Which if they continue at the rate that they are conducting prepared to genocide there as well, again, after the heinous attacks events of the past 25, 30 years of the dictator, then what do we have? We have the Greater Horn of Africa experiencing two sort of partially recognized or not really recognized separatist movements. And people in the comments are rightly pointing out Puntland as well. But I think why this is so relevant and important because of the snowball effect it means for the greater Middle East, the Yemenis cause, the situation with the Americans targeting the Houthis, and then Israel obviously wanting a greater footprint and other strategical place to conduct its operations. But what does that mean for the Emiratis, for the Turks, for the Saudis, for the Qataris, who have all been funding a hell of a load of money into Sudan and other places around there? But I do think that if Israel hadn't jumped the gun on this, I mean, it has its own self-interest, were more African nations to recognize Somalia or begin to consider recognizing it, then that would lead to some developments. I mean, keep in mind, Ethiopia recognizing Somaliland would be historically significant because of what Ethiopia represents in Africa.
Yes, exactly. And it's the headquarters of the African Union. It was the second most popular state in Africa.
The Europeans. It was the only country not colonized properly. Yeah. So I think that this is something to watch, but in the grand scheme of things, as always, unfortunately,
it's not. Do you know what? And to use the vernacular, the boss move now by Israel, of course, is the other thing that breakaway territory. You've got another similar case in many ways, is Yemen, where you had North and South Yemen, and South Yemen had been a British colony until the late 1960s, then became an independent state. And at the end of the Cold War, North and South Yemen united. Again, a very unhappy union. The South felt that it was overlooked by the North and played second fiddle. And what we have now is the Southern Transitional Council pushing for the division of Yemen again. Mm-hmm. And I think that this is a potentially really interesting story as well. Another one just across the water from Somaliland of another, could we see Yemen break apart? Now, the international community has stood very much against this happening. But there are those who are saying, well, look, this is a case of self-determination. We were united before. We were a separate country before, independent. We existed as an independent state for well over 20 years. it hasn't been a happy union. We can be stable if we break away. So I think, if you tie this in with what we've been seeing in international relations over the past sort of 15 to 20 years, I think, we are potentially at a really, really interesting moment in terms of how we're thinking about state recognition and things like that. Pyotr, I was just saying that another fascinating element, if we're talking about de facto states, is Yemen and the Southern Transitional Council, which is effectively the movement for what was South Yemen, to reclaim its independence after its unification with North Yemen at the start of the 1990s. It was a fascinating story that you had two great unifications at that time, East and West Germany and North and South Yemen. Is this something that is also on the horizon?
This is a wider issue of border changes.
Absolutely.
Is one of the
world we're living in.
We have had conversations regarding Ukraine over how catastrophic this would be if Europe and the United States recognized the changing of borders in Ukraine. And yet here we are talking about whether Ethiopia's recognition of Somaliland would have created some kind of snowball effect to give it some sovereign justification because of, history, British imperial presence in the north, Italian in the south, same thing with Yemen. And yet, right, the whole point here is that there has been one in Africa recently. There was one legally recognized border change, and that was the creation of South Sudan, breaking away from the rest of Sudan in a national accepted referendum on secession, which was then in turn recognized by the government in Khartoum. So what we've been talking about here is unilateral secessions are always going to remain illegal, frozen conflicts if the host country does not agree to this. If Mogadishu recognizes Somaliland tomorrow, they can apply for UN membership in the same way that South Sudan, not exactly the strongest country in the world, immediately after the July referendum of 2011, gets into the United Nations in less than a month. The same thing with Montenegro breaking away from the union with Serbia.
But, the key thing, mentioned in both those cases was that there was what we call parent state permission. I mean, in the case of Serbia and Montenegro, there had been agreement on what was called the state union. In the case of South Sudan and Sudan, the war, there were effectively two civil wars. There was a hiatus when there was a peace deal that eventually fell apart. But that was Africa's longest running civil war that we saw in Sudan. And it was always a very odd situation. I mean, Sudan was not a comfortable country. You had the Arab Muslim North, and then you had the Christian animist sub-Saharan South. It had been essentially forced together again, Britain. And what the turning point in that situation was evangelical Americans. It was, you had under Omar al-Bashir, who was the Sudanese leader, who was cozying up to Islamist groups. After 9/11, Bush made it very clear that he wasn't going to tolerate any more of this, no more Al-Qaeda operating out of any of these countries. And then the Christian Americans got involved and said, look, there's also this civil war that's going on there. And so the United States brokered what was actually a fascinating agreement. And I'm going to take a little segue. I always thought was the best option for dealing with Kosovo, by the way, in the United States brokered an agreement that said to South Sudan and North Sudan, look, you're going to live as one for another 6 years. Here's an autonomy agreement. You're going to be given maximum autonomy. At the end of that 6 years, there's going to be a referendum. If you're happy with the arrangement, fine, it'll continue. If you vote against it, you'll get your independence. And it was a real face-saving way out for the Sudanese, because it said to the Northern Sudanese, look, you now have 6 years, and I'll use this term advisedly, to love bomb the South. to show that you really want them and that you can make it work. Now, I think we all knew where it was going, but it provided that face-saving way out. And so it was a really fascinating situation to watch. And of course, when the referendum did come around in 2011, it was overwhelming. I mean, we're talking 98, 99%.
Yes.
It was all monitored. It wasn't. And so that's why, but crucially, the very first country in the world to recognize South Sudan's independence was Sudan.
Yes.
So there was absolutely no question. And it was I think it was the shortest process of membership of the UN. But interesting enough, South Sudan was the last country to join the UN.
Background to more recent developments, because if you two want to have more of a deeper dive on the historical,
listen, I've got lots of videos on this stuff on my channel for anyone who doesn't know what I do.
But look, as I said, I've seen it firsthand, being in Africa for nearly 3 years. Just how complex these border exchanges are. But the point I always like to bring it back round to, and sort of maybe we can begin to wind down on a more positive, constructive, forward-looking outlook, is that, the biggest advocates of the UN, or what the UN stands for, which is sovereignty, right to self-determination, territorial integrity, a lot of the things that we think are being evaporated or are hypocritically invoked by some but not upheld, is Africa. A lot of the African nations that came out of decolonization recognized that they had to try to get on with the borders that they had now and respect that. And so they're some of the biggest upholders of these principles, these values that a lot of Western nations or others don't acknowledge. So, the situation around Somaliland, personally, my position is quite simple. If the people there are so desiring of independence, it would make sense just to give them that opportunity to seek it. I know that would make Somalia weaker, but the country would probably actually prosper much better long term, because they would have a much simpler border situation. They would have neighbors that they can trade with. They would be reintegrated into the international economy, and ultimately the situation would improve for them. But that's not how statehood and self-determination seems to work. And what I find disconcerting is that, again, you have these great power moments, Trump sort of playing whack-a-mole with different regions of the world, thinking, which one shall I open and target this afternoon, sort of thing. So suddenly Venezuela's in his sights, and then 2 hours later he's like, actually, I'm going to talk about Somalia now. And then Israel goes ahead and does that. So I think we're going to see more of the same next year by Trump, trying to just arbitrarily just engage people and say things, and creating disturbances and tumultuous side effects, because he just makes some throwaway remarks which causes everyone else to react. But yeah, I mean, guys, I know you can continue on your
can I just jump in, because I was, there was a super chat that somebody put in, Joe Mama 560, and thank you very much for that. And we sort of touched on it a little bit earlier, but I think it is really interesting because, so much of what we're discussing at the moment is about US foreign policy. And essentially what he asked is, how are the Republicans able to repackage war with Venezuela, foreign economic stimuli to Argentina, and AI, crypto, and safe base with MAGA? Marjorie Taylor Greene's Pulled the Veil and Republican town halls are abysmal recordings of MAGA losing faith. And I think that this is the really interesting thing, that the MAGA loyalists who had voted for one type of Trump are getting a very different type of Trump. As it gets closer to the midterms, we had sort of talked a little bit about this, but it would be interesting just to get your thoughts on this. Where does Trump go on foreign policy now? Is he going to have to rein it in to try and salvage the MAGA vote, or is he just so committed now that it's all in, and we're just going to see more and more of this chaos and disruption?
Is that to me? No,
I think to either. I think that Michael being the resident American, maybe to him first, but
as I said, we have a two-party system here. So the worst that Trump can experience is that a lot of MAGA people just stay home, because they're not going to vote Democrat. They will not vote Democrat. There was somebody way earlier in the conversation when I was talking about, Mamdani and others, and I said, don't read too much into all of this. And the comment was, what's more important is blue MAGA. And I don't know if you are familiar with blue MAGA, but this is sort of the Gavin Newsom type of approach. It's MAGA, but a little bit more, gay friendly, a little bit more DEI. Pardon me for a moment, my phone was ringing. So I know that's my phone.
I think it's time to end the stream, guys. We've got
what I'm saying is that I mean. I would say that Trump right now is very well insulated within his followers. Yes, there are a number of MAGAs that have been disenfranchised because of the tariffs, but they were never considered to be anything other than just voting foot soldiers. They're not donors. They're not high-level supporters. They're not people that Trump relies on for his transactional services. And everything, according to Trump, is transactional. The whole Somaliland, someone had said that the recognition was, of course it's transactional. Any recognition of any disputed territory by a country outside of the international framework is absolutely transactional. That's going to be 2026 here, chaps. The year of transactional politics.
Yeah, I would say simply on US domestic politics, which I really, I observe, but I don't comment on unless it has implications for Europe or foreign policy more broadly. I think that what's interesting is around this attempt at gerrymandering again, and that the California or Gavin Newsom entity was quite quick to sort of retaliate by redrawing their own, so that there were more representatives for each side again, or something like that. So what I think is important domestically speaking is right now we have a very clear split within the MAGA camp, the Marjorie Taylor Greene and that whole fiasco that happened a few weeks ago is remarkable. I certainly think it's something that we have to watch play out more next year and what it means for the Trump administration's performance in the midterms. But that doesn't mean that, because you have now technically three camps, you could argue, more traditional, moderate Republicans, the sort of Mitt Romney types who maybe are independent now. But you also have Trump's camp, and then you have this other form of MAGA, which is sort of even more isolationist or just gravitating away from what Trump has been doing, which is one of the comments someone said, which I wanted to reference, was also the attacks on Nigeria in the past few days. That's certainly not an isolationist president. That's a president who's being quite interventionist. So I think that's going to be very interesting. But then this obviously is all just the GOP. On the Democratic side, to Michael, your point, there is no unity. There is no clear figurehead, if you like, in Democratic world, the Democrats' world, who is clearly stepping into the fray. Could it be Gavin Newsom? I feel like he's made some improved efforts to sort of try to be that person, but can I see him being the person nominee for 2029 or 8 or whenever it is? It's too early to tell, but my point is that while the GOP has its internal rumblings, the Democrats are nowhere, and both parties are trailing in the opinion polls. They're all very unpopular as far as I can tell, and so that's why so much of focus is just on Trump, because he seems to be the most easy to focus on, at least as specifically media inward looking on America, if that makes sense. But yeah, I think we're going to see shifts in America's domestic policy next year, but I don't think anything necessarily. I find it hard to see what's going to be bigger than Charlie Kirk's assassination and some of the other events we've seen this year in the US domestic politics. So I could be wrong, but yeah, it's I'm as always focusing more on the global situation. Yeah. But I don't know if we want to make some final comments there, guys. We've been going for 2 hours, which is
pretty long. Well, it's nice to have the team back together. It's been rather a long time, and I do hope that we can do more of these again. It's always sort of good fun, and I think it's also lovely to all the people in the comments. Thank you very much. We do try and watch the comments coming through on the 3 channels. They're sort of aggregated together, so it sort of comes together quite quickly. But it is brilliant to see so many of the familiar faces there, or the familiar names, I should say. I guess sort of maybe on a final note, what are the big concerns? The one big concern we should be watching out for next year, and what would be the one positive story that maybe is on the horizon?
Michael,
which one is that? I was reading the comments. I'm sorry.
What would be your main concern for sort of looking ahead 2026? What is the thing that sort of keeps you up at night worrying in international relations, but also what would be the positive good news story that we could be seeing?
I mean, as far as international relations, are concerned, is, my thoughts, my focus is on Gaza and the West Bank. This is ultimately the make or break moment, because we are watching a genocide on live stream. And the world, or the countries that claim to be speaking out on behalf of crimes against humanity like this, are doing little to nothing. This is the big thing that is putting, in my opinion, the biggest dent in the legitimacy of Western democratic liberalism. So whether or not there is a greater international resolve, whether Europe or the United, I have absolutely no idea. Someone had said that I'm kind of the doomer in the crowd here. I'm sorry. This is what happens when you're, more so on the doomer Marxist side. As far as domestic stuff is concerned, I'm actually quite concerned about the increasing militarization of the security apparatus here in the United States. The increasing activities of groups like ICE, but also the idea that the Trump administration has been vocally saying that they want to expand the surveillance networks against any perceived attempts at anti-Americanism. Nobody makes Antifa look more organized and look more determined to overthrow the world than MAGA Republicans. They give Antifa, I think, way too much credit for anything here. But I really, the other thing that I would like to see, and this I don't have a lot of hope for, but I can remain slightly optimistic. You were talking, Pyotr, about who is going to emerge as a leader of the Democratic Party. Newsom seems to be somebody that a lot of people are looking to, but he is not well liked among the more lefty groups, among the more progressive groups. People are talking about whether or not Zoran can become more of this lightning rod. But the reality in the United States is that lefties like Mamdani or AOC or even Bernie, if they become too popular, they get hammered down. And they end up becoming more complacent and more compromising with liberal centrism. And the reality is that, yes, there is there's a huge group of people, 35 and younger, that just think differently because they don't have the socioeconomic, socio-political mobility that older generations had. But there's one small problem with all of this and the way this country is run. They don't have money. They're not funding politics. So they can voice their grievances, but these are empty grievances at the end of the day, as far as politics are concerned in this country. So, you look at the MAGA farmers that were disenfranchised by Trump. And I said, Trump doesn't care about them because they're just simply voting foot soldiers. That's it. They don't have the organization to actually change the way policy operates. So I would like to see that. I would like to see some ability at policy changing, ideas changing in the United States. Until that time happens, we're going to just see politics as usual.
Yeah, what's your good, bad news stories?
Yeah.
Well, I think a comment from a viewer sort of, I think we were trying to be polite and allow someone to speak before us, but, it's all relative. Reporting on...
Yes, I can see that.
Working in geopolitics or international relations or whatever is not something, especially if you cover the Ukraine war as much as I do, exclusively, it's not something that is unfortunately something you can report of in positive light. more you can just hope for positive developments in the sense of, and this leads me to my primary point, which is that I am cautiously optimistic about Europe next year. Maybe it's I've got my head in the sand, or it's my rose tinting glasses because I am European and want the best for Europe. But specifically in the area of foreign policy, I remain cautiously optimistic about their ability to pursue strategic autonomy more, and to push back against Putin's and to an extent Trump's, or especially Vance's propaganda. I think this will become very clear after the Munich Security Conference next year, where Vance obviously made his very infamous speech at the beginning of this year. But I also realistic about that. And I think next year is going to be pretty tough. Again, just to summarize everything that we've touched on this conversation, mainly Russia, Ukraine, Europe, because of the magnitude of it. But we are seeing escalations in Venezuela with the Trump administration. We have the worst, bloodiest war of this year or current ongoing conflict in Sudan, completely forgotten about. We've just had a sham election in Burma or Myanmar, which has not been barely covered because the junta is desperately trying to bring an end to that conflict, which has been waging for 5 years now. We have the situation between Iran, Israel, America. Of course, we have Israel-Palestine, which since the peace deal or ceasefire has been invoked or implemented has been very little covered, apart from site-specific entities like Al Jazeera. We have the Chinese conducting military operations around Taiwan right now, which we've barely touched. And of course, we also have the DRC, or the Democratic Republic of Congo, where we've been seeing these efforts at peace deals. Oh, and who can forget the border clashes between Cambodia and Thailand? The point I'm making is that that is just, I don't know, what is that? A list of 10 plus geopolitical developments that have been flashpoints or ongoing or whatever. And it's incredibly difficult for us as people who cover all this to cover it all adequately, let alone feel optimistic. But optimistically, yeah, I'm going to feel slightly hopefully that Europe can step up, and therefore by stepping up, it can take more leadership in other issues. I also remain cautiously optimistic about the UN, given Trump's sort of willingness to continue to supply it. But there's also suggesting she's going to pull out of the WHO. So ultimately, I think we're going to see a continued not disintegration, that's too strong a word, but a greater reconstruction of the world order. And certainly, but I certainly don't feel that sort of the West is done and Europe's a complete lost regard and America's like, no, I think the system is designed that even if Trump tries to do as much as he can to destroy it or to deconstruct it, it's not going to go away. And I think after the midterms as well, that all his power will be hampered, and therefore we won't see quite as much disruption as we've seen in the first year, as in 25 and possibly next year. But anyway, I'm rambling now, so we shall have to see what comes first next year, and when we reconvene, perhaps in late January, in a couple of weeks' time, gentlemen, we can reconvene, make this a regular fixture again for people who clearly want it. I see a lot of people very much keen for us to do this again. So, of course. No, actually, yeah. Someone's put it best. AI. Forget everything I just said, guys. AI takes over Skynet.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of a more comical Skynet than anything else. But yeah, glad to know that I'm not the only one that's seen Terminator.
No. Well, Thank you very much for watching, everyone. Do follow James, Michael, myself. As always, I try to operate a bit between host and participant, so don't be too critical of my interjections at times. And I wish you all a very happy new year and best wishes to everyone watching. And even if we disagree, it's important that we can agree to disagree.
And yes, a huge thank you to everyone who's been watching. And nice to see so many of the familiar faces back.
And Happy New Year to both of you, as well as everybody out there. And to those that are celebrating old calendar Christmas on the 7th of January, preemptive Merry Christmas as well.
Yes. And Happy New Year to everyone.
Yes.
Yes. Happy New Year. See you on the other side.